Britain's southern strategy rested on a dangerous assumption. Military conquest would unlock a deep reserve of Loyalist support. On October 7, 1780, that assumption was tested on King's Mountain, a wooded ridge in South Carolina. Major Patrick Ferguson held the summit with roughly 1,100 Loyalist militiamen. Around him, about 900 mounted Patriot volunteers were closing a ring through the forest. Most wore no uniform, served outside the Continental Army, and had crossed the Appalachians without government orders. The question was larger than who would hold the ridge. Could an improvised frontier force break the system Britain expected to use to control the South? Only months earlier, the answer appeared to be no. British commanders had spent years fighting an expensive, indecisive war in the northern colonies. They now turned south, believing the region contained enough Loyalists to convert battlefield victories into lasting political control. Regular troops would seize major cities and destroy organized resistance. Local supporters of the Crown would then police roads, settlements, and the countryside. For a time, events seemed to confirm that plan. The strategy promised to reduce Britain's dependence on regular troops while widening the political reach of every victory. It also carried a hidden risk. Loyalist strength could not be measured only by declarations of allegiance made under military pressure. If local support failed when British protection receded, each isolated post could become a liability rather than an instrument of control. In May 1780, General Sir Henry Clinton arrived before Charleston, South Carolina. He brought more than 14,000 troops and a fleet of warships. Charleston was the wealthiest city in the southern colonies and the principal gateway to the region. Clinton enclosed it from land and sea, leaving its defenders with no reliable route of escape. About 5,000 Continental soldiers under General Benjamin Lincoln remained behind the city's defenses. Their position weakened as British artillery struck the city, supply vessels failed to enter, and smallpox spread among the Americans. On May 12, Lincoln surrendered his garrison. It was the largest American surrender of the Revolutionary War. No greater United States military capitulation would occur until Bataan in 1942. Britain had captured a field army and secured the southern coast without having to destroy that army in open battle. The victory also removed a major source of trained American resistance. Charleston made the southern strategy look not merely plausible, but efficient. Clinton soon returned to New York, leaving General Lord Charles Cornwallis to extend British authority inland. Cornwallis built a chain of fortified posts from the coast toward the Carolina interior. Those positions protected roads, supported patrols, and gave Loyalist militia places from which to operate. Families loyal to King George were encouraged to organize and arm. Suspected rebels faced coercion, including demands for allegiance and threats against their property. The next major test came outside Camden, South Carolina, on August 16, 1780. General Horatio Gates brought a hastily assembled Southern army against Cornwallis. Gates carried the reputation of Saratoga, where a British army had surrendered in the north. At Camden, that reputation offered no protection. American militia fled early, while the Continentals who remained were overwhelmed. Nearly 1,000 Americans were killed or captured. Gates escaped on horseback and continued for almost 60 miles, ending his effective military career. Below Virginia, organized Continental resistance nearly disappeared. Cornwallis controlled the principal towns, important roads, and much of the populated Low Country. The Southern Revolution had not ended, but its formal military structure had been badly broken. Britain now needed its Loyalist network to turn that collapse into control. This distinction shaped everything that followed. British regulars could win battles and occupy strongpoints, but they could not be present in every settlement. The countryside had to be governed through allegiance, intimidation, patrols, and local militia. That made the western flank more than a geographic edge. It was a test of whether British power could reproduce itself beyond the reach of the main army. Patrick Ferguson was assigned to strengthen that network on Cornwallis's western flank. He was a 36-year-old Scottish major, an accomplished marksman, and the designer of an innovative breech-loading rifle. A wound received at Brandywine had permanently damaged his right arm, but he remained an active and forceful officer. Cornwallis gave him responsibility for recruiting, arming, and training Loyalist militia. Ferguson was the only British regular in the force he eventually led through the backcountry. His command consisted largely of American colonists fighting for the crown. Ferguson taught them formation drill, discipline, and the use of the bayonet. The result was not a British regular regiment, but it was more organized than many militia formations on either side. His men could move quickly, strike Patriot homes and supply points, and disperse resistance before local forces gathered. Their methods also made political submission inseparable from personal danger. Rebel sympathizers were pressured to swear loyalty or risk losing farms and possessions. Some complied, while others hid or moved west. By late September, Ferguson had advanced into western North Carolina with approximately 1,100 Loyalist militiamen. His success encouraged confidence in the British rear and fear among Patriot communities. Yet the same campaign that secured his immediate position was creating enemies beyond it. Ferguson's next message would give those enemies a common purpose. Ferguson had reason to trust his methods. He had moved quickly through the foothills, struck before scattered opponents could organize, and had not yet suffered a comparable defeat. He was proud of the militia he had trained from farmers and tradesmen. Their discipline appeared to prove that Loyalist recruitment could supply the kind of force Cornwallis's wider plan required. West of the Blue Ridge lay settlements along the Watauga, Nolichucky, and Holston rivers, in what is now eastern Tennessee. The people there lived beyond the strongest reach of colonial government. Many were farmers and hunters with experience defending remote homesteads. Some had fought indigenous opponents, and the land they occupied was still claimed by the Cherokee. Their relationship to the Revolution had often been distant, local, and irregular rather than directed by continental authorities. That background complicates any simple portrait of the settlers as representatives of an established nation. Their communities had been created through frontier expansion into contested indigenous land. They were accustomed to organizing defense locally and responding to threats without waiting for distant institutions. The same independence that placed them at the margins of revolutionary command now made them capable of acting when formal American power in the South had collapsed. Ferguson regarded those settlements as a possible threat to his flank. In late September, he sent a paroled prisoner across the mountains with a warning. Unless the settlers ended their opposition to the crown, Ferguson threatened to cross the range, hang their leaders, and destroy their communities with fire and sword. The warning was intended to deter action. Instead, it converted a distant war into a direct threat against homes, families, and local leaders. Colonel Isaac Shelby was a 29-year-old militia officer who had fought at Musgrove Mill. He carried the news to Colonel John Sevier. Their response reversed Ferguson's intended logic. They would not wait behind the mountains for his arrival. They would gather armed men, cross the range, and find him first. Riders spread the call through communities where authority depended less on formal rank than on personal reputation. On September 25th, the first large body assembled at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River, near present-day Elizabethton, Tennessee. Men arrived from settlements scattered across hundreds of miles. Some rode, some came on foot, and many carried their own long rifles, powder, and provisions. Others possessed little beyond what neighbors could share. Roughly 1,000 volunteers gathered over 2 days without a centralized government directing the expedition. Their leadership was collective and potentially awkward. Colonel William Campbell brought about 400 Virginians. Shelby and Sevier each brought approximately 240 men from Sullivan and Washington counties. Colonel Charles McDowell added roughly 160 refugees from Burke and Rutherford counties, many already displaced by Ferguson's Loyalists. None of the colonels clearly outranked the others, and no established chain of command bound the whole force together. No legislature, continental general, or state executive had issued a unified order for the march. The colonels had to negotiate decisions among themselves and rely on each contingent to remain with its familiar leader. That arrangement could have produced paralysis. Instead, the narrow objective allowed separate local commands to cooperate without pretending they had become one conventional regiment. The expedition had no formal supply line, artillery train, or organized cavalry arm. Its horses served primarily to move riflemen quickly across difficult country. Food consisted largely of what the men could carry, including parched corn and dried meat. Their immediate objective, however, was uncomplicated: locate Ferguson before he could threaten the mountain settlements. Before departure, Presbyterian minister Samuel Doak addressed them with a biblical phrase, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The words became a battle cry for the march. The crossing tested the expedition before it met an enemy. Late September, rain soaked the Blue Ridge trails and turned narrow paths into mud. Horses lost footing on rocks, while men climbed through gaps that a conventionally supplied army might have avoided. The volunteers had no tents, and some lacked shoes. At night, they lay in wet hunting shirts, often without fires because the wood would not burn. The column extended for miles through forest and mountain passes. Men slipped, remounted, and continued with little shelter or reserve equipment. 2 deserted during the crossing. One reportedly attempted to warn Ferguson, although historians still debate whether the warning reached him. Ferguson appears to have learned that a force was approaching, but he lacked reliable knowledge of its size and speed. The pace mattered as much as endurance. A slower army carrying wagons, tents, and artillery would have announced itself and given Ferguson time to withdraw. The volunteers accepted exposure and hunger in exchange for movement. Their hardship was not proof of invulnerability. It was the logistical price of reaching the western flank before British command could respond. The expedition's cohesion did not come from enlistment contracts, pay, or a distant command. The volunteers had no draft obligation, enlistment bonus, or promised pension. Many participants were neighbors, relatives, church members, and hunting companions. They understood the local leaders asking them to continue, even when no single colonel controlled the whole column. Ferguson's threat had aligned their private interests with a military objective. That combination made the force difficult to deter, though it did not make the volunteers trained regular soldiers. As the column moved east, additional militia joined. Colonel Benjamin Cleveland arrived with about 350 men from Wilkes and Surry counties in North Carolina. Cleveland was a physically imposing figure, reportedly weighing more than 300 pounds. He also carried a severe reputation for executing Tories. By October 6th, the combined Patriot strength had grown to approximately 1,400. Cleveland's presence added men, local knowledge, and another strong personality to an already crowded council. Accounts remembered the size of both the colonel and the horse that carried him. More important was the condition of his followers. They came from backcountry counties where the struggle between Patriot and Loyalist neighbors had become personal, punitive, and difficult to separate from older local grievances. Numbers alone did not solve the expedition's problem. Ferguson was mobile, the Patriots were uncertain of his position, and Cornwallis's main army remained within possible reach. At Cowpens, a cattle grazing ground in South Carolina, the colonels met in council. If they advanced as one large body, Ferguson might escape. If they pursued too quickly with only part of the force, tired men could be isolated in hostile country. They chose speed. About 900 of the best mounted men, riding the strongest available horses, would continue through the night. The remainder would follow as rapidly as possible. The selected column had to locate Ferguson before he joined Cornwallis or received reinforcement. It was a calculated risk made necessary by the limits of time and intelligence. If their information proved wrong, the advance guard would spend its strength chasing an empty report. If the horses failed, exhausted riflemen could be stranded far from support. If Ferguson reached Cornwallis, the Patriots would face regular troops as well as Loyalist militia. The decision at Cowpens, therefore, committed the expedition to immediate contact on whatever ground Ferguson had chosen. Rain continued during the night ride, and the trails again dissolved into mud. Some men dozed in their saddles and woke when their horses stumbled. Others fell and had to regain the column on foot. The riders continued, and no one turned back. No formal logistics system waited behind them if the pursuit failed. By dawn, the rain had ended, but fog remained in the valleys and along the ridges. On the morning of October 7th, local scouts and a captured Loyalist supplied the needed information. Ferguson had camped on Kings Mountain, about 16 miles south of the present North Carolina border. The name suggested a greater height than the ground possessed. The ridge stood only about 60 feet above its surroundings and extended roughly 600 yards. Its elongated summit narrowed toward the northeast and widened toward the southwest. Hardwood trees and dense undergrowth covered the slopes. Ferguson considered the position defensible because high ground usually favored the force holding it. According to later accounts, he boasted that even God Almighty could not drive him from Kings Mountain. Whether remembered exactly or not, the statement captured his confidence. Yet the ridge offered no completed fortification, no secure route of withdrawal, and no protection from encirclement. The summit's shape intensified those problems. It resembled an elongated footprint, narrow toward one end and broader toward the other. A defender could look down on an approaching force, but could not see every wooded slope equally well. Once attackers occupied the full circumference, Ferguson would have to defend a perimeter longer than the summit's confined interior could comfortably support. The wooded slopes also reduced the advantage normally supplied by a compact summit position. Attackers could approach under cover from several directions. Defenders moving to repel one threat would expose themselves to fire from another side. The narrow top gave Ferguson limited space to shift more than 1,000 men. High ground would help only while he controlled the shape of the battle. The Patriot column reached the area at about 3 in the afternoon. The men dismounted, tied their horses, and formed under their separate colonels. Their plan relied on coordination without elaborate command machinery. Each contingent would take a different face of the ridge, climb through the trees, and close toward the summit. The goal was not a single breakthrough, but a ring that Ferguson could not escape. At approximately 3:15, the attack began. Shelby's men moved against the southern slope, while Sevier's approached from the north. Campbell's Virginians advanced at the northeastern end, and Cleveland's men pressed the southwestern side. Other elements completed the encirclement as the line climbed. Rifle fire began from several directions before Ferguson could concentrate on one front. The attackers carried long rifles, familiar from hunting and frontier warfare. In skilled hands, those weapons could strike accurately at 200 yards or more. Most Loyalists used smoothbore muskets, including weapons of the Brown Bess pattern. Their practical effectiveness was nearer 80 yards. The rifle's accuracy came with disadvantages, including slower loading and no bayonet. On open ground, disciplined musket formations could exploit those weaknesses. The comparison was therefore not simply one of a superior weapon against an inferior one. Muskets were faster to load and suited to volleys and bayonet action. Rifles rewarded dispersed marksmen who could select targets from concealment. Kings Mountain favored the latter use because the forest denied the Loyalists a broad, clear field in which formation and rapid collective fire could dominate. Kings Mountain was not open ground. Trees broke formations, concealed individual marksmen, and allowed small groups to choose cover. The attackers did not need to maintain a continuous line as they climbed. Ferguson's Loyalists, by contrast, depended on coordinated movement and bayonet charges to clear each threatened slope. The terrain forced two different military systems into direct competition. The first bayonet attacks demonstrated why Ferguson trusted his training. Loyalist lines drove downhill with fixed steel, and the riflemen in front of them withdrew. Without bayonets, the Patriots could not safely receive the charge at close range, but their withdrawal did not become a general flight. They moved back among the trees, reloaded, and returned as soon as the Loyalists climbed toward the summit again. Each counterattack gained temporary space at one point, while weakening another. When Loyalists charged Campbell or Shelby, riflemen on opposite slopes continued upward and fired into exposed positions. When the defenders turned to meet that pressure, the men they had just displaced resumed their climb. Ferguson could push the ring outward locally, but he could not break it everywhere. The encirclement converted every successful charge into another demand on his shrinking reserve. Black powder smoke accumulated among the trees and across the summit. Visibility shortened as repeated firing continued. The battle became a series of close, confused contests around rocks, trunks, and patches of undergrowth. Men fought with muskets, rifles, bayonets, knives, and gun stocks when distance disappeared. Wounded Patriots and Loyalists sought cover wherever the slope allowed it. The sound carried no single front. Shots, shouted orders, whistles and cries arrived from different sides of the ridge. Smoke concealed some movements while revealing others through fresh muzzle flashes. The basic pattern remained clear. Patriots kept climbing. Loyalists kept counterattacking. The available ground on the summit kept contracting. Ferguson remained mounted and used a silver whistle to direct attention toward threatened sections. He wore a checkered hunting shirt over his uniform, making the officer on horseback unusually visible. Patriot riflemen later said they deliberately aimed at him. His sword was reportedly shot from his hand, while other balls struck his clothing and hat. With his right arm disabled from Brandywine, he handled his weapon with his left and continued leading counterattacks. His personal courage could not repair the geometry of the position. As officers fell, the Loyalist perimeter contracted toward the crest. White flags began to appear among men seeking to surrender. Accounts state that Ferguson cut down more than one flag and refused to yield to opponents he regarded as bandits. The refusal prolonged a battle whose tactical outcome was becoming clear. Within roughly 45 minutes of the opening fire, the defenders were compressed into an increasingly small area. They had no reserve position beyond the crest and no protected road to the main British army. Individual Loyalists could see men on neighbouring slopes surrendering or falling. Ferguson's authority still produced local resistance, but it no longer offered a workable solution to encirclement. Around 4 in the afternoon, Ferguson attempted a final mounted escape. With several officers near him, he drove toward the southeastern slope, apparently seeking a break in the Patriot line. His sword was raised, and his whistle sounded as the group descended. Several rifle balls struck him almost together. His foot caught in a stirrup, and the horse dragged him across the rocky ground before stopping. Once Ferguson was dead, the remaining Loyalist officers raised a final white flag. From the opening shots to the surrender, the battle had lasted about 65 minutes. A force, assembled without a unified command, had surrounded and defeated a larger militia body trained by a British regular officer. The result came from terrain, converging attacks, local cohesion, accurate rifle fire, and Ferguson's inability to open an escape route. It was not the destruction of a professional British army, but it was the collapse of an important Loyalist command. The casualty reports show both the scale of the defeat and the danger of treating rounded figures as exact. The reported figures list 290 Loyalists killed, 163 wounded, and 668 captured. Those categories total slightly more than the approximate strength of 1,100, reflecting the limits of wartime estimates. What is clear is that Ferguson's organized force ceased to function. Patriot losses were reported as 28 killed and 62 wounded. The contrast in losses became central to later retellings, sometimes at the expense of accuracy about the forces involved. The attacking men were experienced with firearms and frontier conditions, even if they lacked regular military training. The defenders were disciplined, Loyalist militia, not a fortified British regular army. The achievement remains striking without turning either side into something it was not. Victory did not end the violence. Some surrendering Loyalists were shot or bayoneted after laying down their weapons. Colonel Campbell eventually restored order, but many Patriots had arrived with memories of burned homes, raids, and murdered neighbors. Those experiences help explain the anger without excusing attacks on prisoners. Kings Mountain was both a military success and an episode of civil war among Americans. In the following days, Patriot officers convened a hurried field court-martial for prisoners accused of crimes against civilians. 36 men were tried and convicted. 9 were hanged from a large tulip tree before the executions stopped. Some officers objected to the proceedings, and reports of an approaching British force added pressure to move. The episode remained part of the battle's human and ethical cost. The Patriot column then began a difficult northward march, with hundreds of captives. Guarding, feeding, and moving so many prisoners placed new demands on an army that had brought little supply capacity. Many Overmountain men soon left and returned to their settlements. They had crossed the range for a limited purpose, not for permanent service. Ferguson was dead, his command had surrendered, and the immediate threat to their homes had receded. Their departure demonstrated both the strength and the limitation of the expedition. Local purpose had generated exceptional speed and cohesion, but it did not automatically create a standing army for a long campaign. The Patriot cause still needed officers, supplies, regular formations, and sustained coordination. Kings Mountain removed an immediate danger. It did not solve every military problem in the Southern Department. The larger consequence unfolded at Cornwallis's headquarters. Ferguson had protected the western flank of the British advance into North Carolina. His defeat removed roughly 1,100 trained Loyalists, whom Cornwallis could not quickly replace. It also demonstrated that British outposts and militia networks could be attacked beyond the reach of the main army. Cornwallis now had to reconsider an advance built on the expectation of local support. Contemporary accounts describe shock within the British command, and Cornwallis was reported to have become physically ill. He halted his northward movement and withdrew to Winnsboro, South Carolina. There he spent nearly 3 months regrouping and trying to repair the Loyalist system. After Charleston and Camden, British movement had seemed consistently forward. Kings Mountain forced the campaign into a pause and retreat. That pause affected more than a marching schedule. Cornwallis had to protect connections, reassess recruitment, and replace a flank force that had vanished in little more than an hour. Every week spent recovering gave scattered Patriots time to communicate and assemble. The British still possessed powerful regular units, but their operational freedom now depended on a political network whose reliability had been called into question. The psychological result traveled through communities faster than any formal order. Potential Loyalist recruits saw that service under the Crown could expose them to isolation and defeat. Some men stayed home, changed allegiance, or disappeared from militia roles. The network on which British pacification depended weakened. The change was neither universal nor instantaneous, but it undermined the political premise of the Southern strategy. Patriot morale moved in the opposite direction. Charleston and Camden had made resistance appear futile across much of the South. Kings Mountain offered evidence that British-aligned forces could be defeated decisively under favorable conditions. Militia recruitment increased, and men who had withdrawn from the struggle reconsidered their choices. The victory did not restore a continental army by itself, but it created room for one to operate again. That room mattered when Congress appointed General Nathanael Greene to command the Southern Department. Greene arrived in December 1780 and adopted a campaign based on movement, dispersion, and persistent pressure. He did not need to destroy Cornwallis in one pitched battle. He needed to preserve American forces while compelling the British to march, consume supplies, and extend vulnerable communications. Partisan leaders such as Francis Marion and Andrew Pickens attacked the support structure behind British positions. Greene's method accepted tactical risk in order to produce operational strain. Separate American forces could threaten different areas, reunite when useful, and avoid being trapped, as Gates had been at Camden. Cornwallis could still win ground, but each pursuit carried him farther from secure supply. The erosion of Loyalist organization after Kings Mountain made that problem harder for Britain to solve. Kings Mountain did not create Greene's strategy, but it changed the conditions in which he could attempt it. Cornwallis had lost time, manpower, confidence, and protection on his western side. The delay gave American leadership an opportunity to reorganize after Camden. Without Ferguson's defeat, Cornwallis might have continued through North Carolina before comparable resistance formed. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but the 3-month interruption carried real operational value. Ferguson's story also became attached to a disputed episode from Brandywine in 1777. He later wrote that an American officer in distinctive dress, accompanied by a French hussar, passed within rifle range. Ferguson chose not to shoot an unsuspecting man from concealment. Later tradition identified the officer as George Washington, although that identification cannot be treated as certain. The encounter remains an arresting possibility rather than a proven turning point. Later, writers linked that choice to Ferguson's refusal to surrender at Kings Mountain. The comparison suggests a personal code of gentlemanly warfare operating in very different circumstances. Yet his final motives cannot be known from battlefield action alone. He spared the unidentified officer at Brandywine. He continued fighting on the ridge at Kings Mountain. He died while attempting to break the encirclement. History turned those events into a moral symmetry more exact than the evidence permits. Prominent Americans later emphasized the battle's importance. Thomas Jefferson called Kings Mountain the turn of the tide of success in the South. Theodore Roosevelt presented the Overmountain Men as a frontier fighting type unlike the regular formations of Europe. Such judgments helped shape national memory, but they also simplified a more complicated event. The victors were citizen militia. Most of the defeated were also American colonists. The frontier settlements stood on land still claimed by the Cherokee. The campaign that followed confirms influence without proving inevitability. American success at Cowpens weakened Cornwallis. The costly struggle at Guilford Courthouse weakened him further. He eventually moved into Virginia. At Yorktown, American and French forces trapped him in October 1781. Those events were connected by accumulated decisions, losses, and logistical pressures. Kings Mountain belonged to that chain. It did not single-handedly determine every link. The Yorktown surrender came almost exactly 1 year after the fighting on the ridge. That proximity encouraged later writers to see a straight road from one event to the other. The road was neither straight nor guaranteed. It passed through new commanders, French military power, continued partisan warfare, additional battles, and British choices made under changing pressure. Today, a granite obelisk stands on the Kings Mountain battlefield. Hardwood forest again covers the ridge, although paths and cleared undergrowth make the modern site easier to cross. Stone markers identify positions associated with the attacking columns, and a cairn marks the place where Ferguson fell. The military park lies near a 2-lane highway and can be missed by travelers who are not seeking it. Its modest scale surprises many visitors. The preserved ground also corrects the imagination. A map can make the encirclement look broad and orderly, while the ridge itself feels close, steep, and obstructed. The attacking columns did not observe one another across an open field. They moved through trees toward a summit where smoke, slope, and undergrowth compressed both vision and command. From the base, the summit can be seen through the trees. Walking the slopes reveals how steep, confined, and tangled the battlefield was. More than 2,000 men were crowded into a fight on a narrow wooded rise, yet the ground never resembles a grand conventional battlefield. Its smallness explains the intensity of the encirclement. The geography that seemed to protect Ferguson instead limited every attempt to respond. Kings Mountain receives less public attention than Lexington, Bunker Hill, or Yorktown. Its immediate achievement was clear. Ferguson's command disappeared. Cornwallis lost his western screen, and the British advance paused. Its later influence was broader, but shared with many other events, commanders, communities, and allied forces. Historians can debate how far the consequences extended. They cannot separate the battle from the recovery of Patriot resistance in the South. The central question, therefore, has a measured answer. The Overmountain expedition did not save the revolution by itself, nor did untrained men simply defeat a professional British army. A self-organized militia force used local trust, mobility, terrain, and a converging plan to destroy a disciplined Loyalist command. In doing so, it exposed the weakness inside Britain's southern strategy. Conquest could not become control when local allegiance remained unstable. On Kings Mountain, a threat meant to secure the frontier instead helped turn the frontier against the crown.